Hurt people hurt people. It's a very simple phrase, and it's one that I am still trying to master myself. I think for me, it's so easy when I get hurt to just focus on my own pain. And sometimes it's hard to take in that larger picture of how this is all fitting together in one kind of big system. Y'all have heard me use this phrase before, and I'll say it again, and I'll probably say it again, well, later on, which is, the pain we do not transform, we will transmit. And so this phrase, hurt people, it's another expression of that. This month's theme through Soul Matters is called Widening the Circle. And I think it's in reference to, it can be just generally widening the circle, but the UUA commissioned a report called Widening the Circle of Concern, the report of the UUA Commission on Institutional Change. Came out in June 2020. And this report was really about dismantling white supremacy culture within Unitarian Universalism. And it was a very strong concerted effort from many, many people coming together to not only examine existing systems, but also offer recommendations of how it all might move forward. And part of it was that there were many, many stories that were included in the report. And oftentimes they weren't actually one story, but they would actually be a composite of stories, sort of put into one story to create an easy narrative in that way. But I think what it also speaks to is this idea that there are many stories basically saying the same thing. And you can kind of put them together into sort of a representative story. And what I heard in these stories over and over and over again was pain. A lot of pain. And I think what was really one very important aspect of this report, and not that this hadn't been done before, but I think a really important aspect of it was just to yet again to recognize that pain and to bring it to light so that we can see it. Here's a quote from the report. It says, "The lack of identifiable and covenantal ways to air, process, and address damaging behavior by the dominant culture toward marginalized folks has caused an intolerable level of pain." The lack of identifiable or covenantal ways to air and process and address damaging behavior by the dominant culture has caused intolerable pain to marginalized folks. So while I'm reading this report and I'm taking in all the recommendations, which are great, generally, very productive, I guess there's a part of me that wonders, where does this pain go? I wasn't seeing that in the recommendations. Where does the pain that spurred all this go? And not only that, where does the pain that perpetrated this pain go? How do we address that? Hurt people are hurting people. What do we do there? So I was asked by my internship committee to preach on the men's work that I do. I'm part of a male spirituality group called Illumin. And to talk a little bit about how that intersects with social justice issues. And I just want to, be clear about something when I talk about men's work as a term, and just, be upfront about my own position in society. I can't necessarily say that the men's work that I engage in necessarily speaks for all men. I come from the privileged place in our culture that I come from. Oftentimes, the men that I work with come from a similar place. And that can inform my entire conception of the larger picture of what it means to be a man. And so I just want to name that here and now, and that's in this space. But I don't necessarily want to talk about just men right now. What I want to talk about, and where I really think it intersects with social justice issues, is this idea of toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is defined as the traditional cultural masculine norms that can be harmful to men, women, and society overall. I'd like to add a little tweak to that definition too, to say it can be harmful to men, women, the person themselves, and society overall. Some of the examples from the interwebs are things like unconditional toughness. This is toxic masculinity. Unconditional toughness. Fear of emotions. Hyper-independence. And aggression or fear toward the other, often including things such as misogyny and homophobia and things that deviate from our normal, what they call normal, again, toxic masculine idea, normal. And I think that toxic masculinity is so ingrained into our culture because we've had a essentially patriarchal system for so long, that to talk about dealing with toxic masculinity, in my opinion, is one huge part of dealing with how we talk about dominant culture. Frankly, most of what the unsavory parts that we consider of dominant culture are direct results of toxic masculine energy that has essentially run amok. So I want to make a few points about it. I just want to say first that toxic masculinity is something that can be taught. It's taught. It's not inherent. Men are not inherently toxic, or whatever part of that masculine part of us, that of whatever gender we may identify as. It's not inherent, it's taught. And it's not necessarily even just a white issue. So here's a quote from Bell Hooks, who was a famous African-American female thinker. My father, who was a very violent, very patriarchal man, he was in the all-black infantry in World War II. He was a boxer. He was a basketball player. He was all of these things that we associate with masculinity. And in fact, really had a lot of disdain for my brother, because actually, my brother was a much softer, warmer human being. And my father looked down on that. He felt that was not masculine. I still think that if we really want patriarchy to change, we are in trouble if we turn our backs on men and not really want to examine, why are men so violent? The author and educator John Bradshaw used to say that the primary form of child abuse is really shaming. And I think that if we look at all of these men and their behavior, it's such shaming behavior. So this is something that gets passed down. And I also want to say that it isn't just a man thing. And I'll tell a story about my own experience in the law. And I think for those that work in the law, the signs of toxic masculinity inherent into that system are everywhere. You just encounter it everywhere you go, pretty much. I mean, even the setup of it, an adversarial system, where we think that justice can be had by essentially pitting two men, as it was created, two men together, and may the best man win. That's justice. So I'm going to tell a story about early on in my legal career. I was still trying to find my way. I had basically no saleable skills. I didn't know what I was doing. And I took a job working at a small litigation boutique that was run by a mother and her daughter. They were both very established litigation attorneys. And so I was learning under them, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And about a month and a half into that job, I got assigned I was supposed to respond to a letter, to write a letter to the judge in response to a letter that the opposing counsel had written. And this letter that the opposing counsel had written was absurd. It was just silly. And you see this in the law sometimes where people equate hyperbole and going full 11 as if that's going to make their argument stronger. So they just say all this stuff that's not true. This is absurd. Superlative this, superlative that. And everyone can read through it. It's silly. And so, opposing counsel had written one of these letters, and I was writing a response to it. And I thought to myself, well, I'll just let them kind of fall on their face with all this absurdity and just write something that seems pretty sober. Right? Just addressing their issues in a methodical way, saying why they're, aren't correct. And, hopefully the judge will see that we're sort of a reasonable party here and he can work with us, can't really work with them kind of thing. So I wrote this letter and I sent it to my boss and who I was working under. And I was working under the daughter at the time, who was sort of a mid-level attorney, so definitely knew what she was doing. And so I'm sitting in my office, hit send. About 5 minutes later, I hear this door open, and then, and I'm like, oh boy, someone's coming for me. Boom, my door opens. What the heck is this? Didn't use that word. And she proceeds to just scream at me about this letter that I had written. What is this? You're not coming with enough energy. This is ridiculous. You clearly don't understand what's going on here. You don't have the first clue what it means to be a lawyer if you're going to write a letter like this. And it was just this, I didn't know what to say. She wanted me to come with that same energy back at them, even though it was absurd. Even though no one's buying it, even though the judge knows, right? But I think it speaks to how we pass these things down. She was taught that by someone. She was taught this is what it means to be a lawyer. Ah! I only lasted about a week and a half more at that place before I went. So in the men's work, we teach away from toxic masculinity, and we teach away from it in a sort of spiritual way. And in some ways it's indirect. We don't necessarily hit it right on. But I do want to talk about the kind of spiritual backbone of the work that we do there and how I think it informs addressing toxic masculinity. So Richard Rohr, who's the developer, he's a Franciscan priest. He did a bunch of research on just various cultures and their initiation rites all throughout the world. And he realized that there were he could kind of synthesize it down to 5 promises of what happens in typical male initiation rites, typically when, boys are becoming men. And he calls them the 5 promises. And they are this: life is hard. You are not that special. Your life is not about you. You are not in control. And you are going to die. Sweet. Wow. And these are really become the spiritual backbone. They help us get in touch with our humanity in that way. So obviously these promises aren't particularly the most alluring things. But I want to talk about what sort of makes toxic masculinity alluring. I think it's easy to kind of look at it as this terrible thing. But we go into it. We choose to go into it. And we have our moments, right? And what is it? And so I've identified something, I'll call it a big lie, because it causes suffering. And to quote the Dalai Lama, all suffering is based on the misconceptions of the nature of reality. And so this big lie, I mentioned it earlier, is the lie of hyper-independence. Hyper-independence. It's as if they say there's a world when you can do it all alone. You can do it all alone in our society. Come join us. Right? Men and everyone else are supposed to be unconditionally tough and hyper-independent. And I don't mean just independence from, a toxic situation or, folks who have in situations where there's a power over and they need to get independence from that. Absolutely. I'm talking about a sort of wider independence, a sort of idea that you're not hooked into a system, that you're out there on your own, doing it on your own, right? And I think this hyper-independence is also ultimately, in some ways, an independence from those 5 promises. Your life doesn't have to be hard. You are that important. Oh, buy this product. You're not going to die, right? So I could kind of talk about these things in an intellectual way or, an academic way, but I kind of want to also try and get a little bit on the emotional level here about this allure and the pain. And as I was dealing with this, I, kind of working through this sermon, I kept coming back to the Simon and Garfunkel song, I Am a Rock. I am a rock. Mm-hmm. And y'all will have to forgive me, I don't have a terribly good voice, but I will sing some of it because I think that it's really important. Just the last part, because I think that it hits on the allure and the pain. So they sing in the final verse, I have my books and my poetry to protect me. I'm shielded in my armor. Hiding in my room, safe within my womb, I touch no one and no one touches me. I am a rock. I am an island. And for those that know the final 2 lines of the song, please do sing it with me now. And a rock feels no pain, and an island never cries. And to me, that's it. I say, who among us hasn't been hurt in their life to the point where they just go, you know what? I'm done with this. I want to be a rock. I want to be an island. I don't want any more pain. I don't want to cry. I'm going to just go in my books, hide in my room. And not just in a very literal way, but even in a societal way. What's going on over there? That's not me. This is my island. And, as I've accepted these 5 promises as being part of life, it's quite hard to look around and watch people really resisting them in the way that it drives them crazy when they do. I'll take, for example, road rage. You're not in control. Let it go. But that person, they should have, right? So I feel like men especially have internalized this hyper-independence. Generally, many men are very lonely. Very few men have a close set of friends, especially guy friends. I think we've seen this. I would guess that many in this room have had fathers that were distant, aloof, hard to know, maybe impossible to know. Dominant culture teaches us that it's every person for themselves. And with this internalized loneliness comes the shame of Bell Hooks' dad shaming his son. Comes the pain. So I want to talk a little bit now about what Illumin does, this male spirituality group. Their sort of main offering is a 5-day spiritual retreat. They call it the Rites of Passage. It's multi-layered. It's very incredible. As one of my mentors describes it, he describes the experience like a depth charge for most of the people that go through it. They see it, it all happens, and the depth charge starts sinking down, and then at some point, it explodes into internal change. And there's many moving parts to it, but one part that I really want to focus on is that it prepares and opens a space for men to grieve communally. To grieve communally. And as in my experience and from listening to many stories, this is actually really the first experience of grieving that men have had. The first public space that's been open to them where they can openly express that grief and that pain. And, Malidoma Somé, if folks are familiar with him, he's done a lot of work with grief. He has a piece of wisdom that always sticks with me, which is this idea that grief is a communal emotion. Grief is a communal emotion. So just like Sandra was sharing in her story, even though it wasn't someone talking to her, it was that sense of being among with others who were feeling that same grief. It really allowed it to actually come. Right? And I think a really important part of it is that oftentimes for us to see our own pain, we need to be able to see the pain in others as well. And that needs to be okay. But what I learned in this was that it's also not just about pain and opening to pain, but when we open to each other's pain, that's how we open to each other's love as well. Can we be in a loving relationship with one another if we're not open to the pain of that person? If we're not there to receive it, if we're not open to it, if we can't hold that with them, can we really be in a loving relationship? I don't believe so. And it really breaks down this idea, too, that we're an island. How can we be an island if we need one another in this, even in just this one way? Right? I'll share the story of my own journey through grief there. I can't speak for what would happen if another went on it, but I can share my own story. Which was that I grew up in a house and in a time, part of it was my parents, part of it was myself, though, where I just felt like I was not allowed to be angry. Anger was not allowed in my house. I didn't allow myself to be angry. And for whatever reason, when I went on this rites of passage, as I'm talking about, and I got put into this communal grieving space, I don't know why. I was sitting there, I was listening to the instructions, how the whole ritual was going to go, and I just knew that my grief was going to come out in rage. Rage. And I didn't have any context for that because I was the type of person who I told myself forever that I was not an angry person. Sure, I'd get sad sometimes. Sure, I might get frustrated or depressed. I had some other word for it, but never angry. I mean, I don't rage. I'd never even done anything like that before. But for whatever reason, in this context, I just knew this was it. This was my chance, kind of thing. And so the ritual started, and that's exactly what I did. I went bonkers, and I just started raging, and something came out of me that I had never known about. I didn't even know it was there, but it was raw. I can kind of say it. I can't even really do it in here. It would shatter the space, right? But it was real. And I ended up raging for about an hour, which, for those who have raged, knows that's a very long time. And I essentially blew out my vocal cords and completely dehydrated myself and essentially collapsed at the end of this thing. And when it was over, I was just incredibly sad. And I didn't know why. I didn't know what was going on, but there was a part of me that kind of felt like, shouldn't I be relieved or something? Didn't I just let a bunch out? Or shouldn't I be feeling kind of loose or something, No, I felt incredibly sad. I was really just withdrawn, processing it. That night, I barely slept, and as I was laying in bed, as the sun was coming up, it dawned on me why I was so sad. And I realized that if I had watched someone that I truly loved rage that hard, I'd feel really sad that they had kept that in for so long, and that had been a part of them that hadn't been able to be expressed. And as that was sinking in, I realized, well, then that must mean that I truly love myself. And it was the first time that I'd ever felt that in my heart. We say those things. I say those things. I'll speak for myself. I say those things. But this was the first time that I really felt it in my heart. And so when I speak of these things of pain opening the door to love, it was true for me. That's why I'm so involved in this work. And something that's happened in there too is also this sense of once this space opened up for me, I wanted it to be open for everyone. Once I got that taste of healing and I saw that this was possible, it was something that I wanted for everyone. And it became imperative to me to spread that healing in any way that I could. And as that truth and that energy kind of went through me, it just started to recode me, just like that depth charge my mentor was talking about. So going back to the Widening the Circle report, I think it makes clear that everyone's pain matters. And the men's work points to the same place. And to be honest, for me, that work starts with men primarily, helping them to see that their own pain matters. There's a lot of talks of social reformation amongst different groups and what that looks like. And there's a strong sense within the men's work that I'm a part of that we need to figure out how to change ourselves appropriately in the context of our society. People can't tell us what we need to do to change. No one has those answers. It's up to us to figure out those answers and to figure out a way. And at least from what I've seen in Illumin, there's movement in these spiritual spaces. And I think it extends out into these wider circles of our society as that pain heals within us. And that's why one of our main things is we say we're focused on inner work that makes a difference in the world. This is what we're talking about. So I want to sort of close up a little bit with a quote from Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt. This is also from the Widening the Circle report. And she speaks of these words coming from marginalized voices within UU, but I believe they also have applicability for all of our culture. She quotes another person saying, "Paloma calls us to be sanctuaries telling our full stories, and engaging one another's healing and one another's pain can guide us into a new way of being." She insists that only when we come to bear witness to the cracked and shattered pieces can we begin to help heal what has been broken. Drawing on Paloma's voice leads me to say that our first principle calls us to learn a language of resilience and liberation in response to the pain of this world we have inherited, so that we might find wholeness and grace in our brokenness. A universalist theology of liberation in the present day centers our capacity to be sanctuaries of radical truth-telling and abundant compassion, so that the all-embracing love at the center of our tradition can serve to make all of us more whole. I love that. I just love that. And I don't mean this to take anything away from the address of marginalized folks in this context, but I really do believe that it's also true for the non-marginalized folks as well. When we open up safe spaces for people to bring their full selves into here at the congregation, we open spaces for healing. I just want to say I was able to attend the Remarkable People meeting this past week. And something really clicked for me while I was in that meeting, and it just warmed my heart. I really understood this congregation. I know I'm relatively new here, still getting my feet wet, but I really understood how y'all show up for one another and how you open spaces to hear one another's stories and get into that realness. And that just gives me so much hope. It was so beautiful to see all these folks showing up just to hear one another's stories. I don't claim to have a answer to, the woes of dominant culture or even toxic masculinity, but to me, this feels like a start. It's a place to start. And from there, I feel like we need to just have a bit of humility and let Spirit do its thing as it guides us. And I don't mean that to take away from other efforts. All efforts matter in these areas of combating this dominant culture. But for me, on a spiritual level, I feel like this is a great place for us to start. And from there, the door to understanding all pain matters opens. And our circle will naturally widen. Maybe so.